Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait just one more minute as people continue to join here. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Andrew Price. I'm President and COO of Competitive Energy Services. I'm pleased to welcome you to our seminar today, Bridging the Future, Managing the Energy Commodity Transition. We have a very full agenda today. I'm going to start by walking you through a brief overview. We're going to start today with a review of energy commodity market trends. If you could go back one slide, there you go, thanks. Over the past year, and we're going to identify several of the primary factors that have been influencing prices. We're all used to domestic oil and gasoline prices being linked to world events, but it's really only recently that US prices for natural gas and electricity have been impacted by world markets in general, and to Europe in particular. So we're going to take some time today and explain why events in Europe can now have a big impact on natural gas prices and electricity prices here in the US, particularly for New England consumers. In the second section, we're going to turn our attention to energy futures pricing and provide some insights into how you might think about energy hedging strategies over the next several years. And in the last section, we're going to look at electrification and how electrification of large portions of our economy, think space heating in homes and electric vehicles, is likely to impact US natural gas markets and what that might mean for you as a consumer in the future. The price of natural gas is obviously important today for heating, and the price of natural gas, as you may know, typically sets the price of electricity most of the time. But we also want to provide some context around an upcoming transition away from natural gas and other fossil fuels, and that's the bridging to the future, as it says in the title of the seminar. And we'll need to transition to a mostly electrified and decarbonized future if we're going to meet our respective state, regional, and national emissions goals. The energy market data and trends we're going to talk about today are certainly relevant nationally. I know we have a few West Coast attendees today, but the vast majority of you who registered today are from the Northeast. And as a result, we're going to provide some focused commentary on what makes the Northeastern US energy markets pretty unique. On the next slide, I'm going to just cover a few logistical items as we get rolling here. If I don't talk too long here, we're going to have time for questions at the end. You should see a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please go ahead and use that whenever you think of a question, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. If we don't get to your question, we'd be happy to follow up separately. Anticipating perhaps your first question, the seminar is being recorded, and we will circulate a link to that recording to everyone who attended today. And finally, you need to stay to the end. There is going to be a giveaway, so stay tuned for that as soon as we finish the presentation today. Before I turn things over to my colleagues, I did want to take the opportunity to just provide a brief introduction to our service offerings to anyone joining today that's not familiar with CES. We're a full-service energy consulting firm with more than 700 clients across the US and Canada. Since our founding more than 2 decades ago, we've always been supplier neutral and product neutral. We always work only for end users. Our services generally fall into the 3 broad categories you see here: strategic procurement, discrete consulting projects, data management, and reporting. And for many of our largest clients, we affectionately refer to as full service clients, we have a custom scope of service that may span all three of these categories. On the next slide, and my final slide, I wanted to also quickly highlight the sustainability and renewable services that we offer. Very similar to the traditional energy commodity markets, we do provide a range of procurement, consulting, and reporting services relevant to on-site renewables, off-site renewables, battery storage projects, greenhouse gas and energy master planning, and many related sustainability services. If anyone has questions about our services or capabilities, we would be more than happy to answer those questions. So please follow up with any of us after the seminar today. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Charlie Agnew to lead us into the review of energy commodity market trends. Charlie.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks for that welcome. And as you mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about natural gas today, since this is one of our primary fuels for heating, industrial processes, and electricity generation today. We're also going to talk about gas in the future, and we think important first to start with some fundamentals. First, when we refer to natural gas commodity, that's the molecules of natural gas, which in our industry get traded in a monthly contract on the New York Mercantile Exchange, or NYMEX, as we'll refer to it as. Delivery of those contracts is done at the Henry Hub in Erath, Louisiana, which connects to many of the major gas markets in the United States. So when you hear about natural gas prices and on the national news channels, that often references the trading activity or prices on the NYMEX. Over on the bad news channel, you'll hear about New England and how we pay an expensive premium in addition to the Henry Hub or NYMEX price. And that's despite our proximity to some of the largest production in the United States. So to explain why that is, I'm going to turn that over to Catherine.
Thanks, Charlie. It's true that we are quite close to the Marcellus Shale, as you can see in the dark gray shaded area of the map here. And that's where a significant portion of US gas production occurs. However, the problem lies with New England's pipeline infrastructure. We simply can't move enough gas along our pipelines to meet heating demand on extremely cold winter days. As you can see on the map here, New England receives gas along three pipelines: Algonquin, shown in teal, Tennessee in dark orange, and Portland, shown in purple. Combined, these pipelines provide a total capacity of 2.5 billion cubic feet per day. This isn't substantial capacity to meet our heating needs in the winter, and as a result, we have to supplement the pipeline gas with some expensive alternatives, most notably liquefied natural gas, or LNG. LNG is delivered by ship to three terminals in the Northeast: Everett, the Northeast Gateway, and Canaport. Together, these LNG terminals can provide a maximum daily send-out of 3 billion cubic feet per day, and that provides an increase to the region's pipeline capacity of over 100%.
Thanks, Catherine. With that in mind, how does LNG impact our New England gas pricing?
Yeah, great question. So to answer that, we need to talk about the basis component of gas prices. As you mentioned earlier, the cost of the actual commodity is referred to as NYMEX, and the second component of an end user's gas cost is basis. Basis prices are tied to the cost of delivering the gas along the interstate pipeline to the end user's local distribution system. We already pay a premium on basis in New England due to our limited pipeline capacity, and the need for liquefied natural gas during the winter escalates that uniquely elevated basis price even further.
Got it. So the uniqueness of New England's gas system, that's important for gas customers, but It's also important to our electricity industry and as well. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Exactly. So compounding the natural gas price issue, New England is more reliant on natural gas for electricity generation on an annual percentage basis than any of our neighboring regions like New York or the Mid-Atlantic or even Texas. Today, around 50% of New England's electricity is generated by natural gas, as you can see shown in the orange portion of the bar. We also receive another 20% of power from in-region solar, wind, and hydro, shown in green and blue. And when accounting for hydropower from Quebec, that's actually more like 30%. But ultimately, the majority of our region's electricity today is generated by gas-fired power plants. And as a result, our electricity prices become equally volatile and correlated. So we can see the connection between New England natural gas prices shown here in orange and electricity prices shown in blue over the past year. As you can see, when gas prices spike, electricity prices follow suit.
That's great, Catherine, helpful to know. And as we try to understand what these gas prices may do, as well as electricity in the future, we do need to know that we're heavily reliant on the commodity price of gas, but also, and maybe more importantly, the cost to bring that fuel into New England, whether that's on a pipe or on a ship. So to talk a little bit more about gas trends and what they might foretell, I'm going to turn it over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Catherine. I would be happy to discuss this. So if we go back to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can see that energy markets hit some historic lows, specifically crude oil, New England natural gas, and New England electricity, which you can see on this graph here. Following that giant contraction of demand and production during COVID, we saw the economy pick back up and demand began to outpace supply growth, causing prices to escalate steadily through early 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, electricity, oil, and natural gas prices in the US began to spike. Anxieties continued to rise as many European nations announced their intent to cut off Russian crude and natural gas supplies before the winter. As international demand for US LNG rose, so did our domestic prices. Most commodities saw an uptick in price heading into the fall of 2022, which you can see demonstrated by the shaded areas in this graph. As European countries began to limit their intake of Russian oil, crude prices experienced a ripple effect across the world. The Brent crude oil ticker is shown here in purple, which is the leading benchmark for globally traded crude oil. It is also shown here in dollars per barrel to demonstrate the way that oil prices spiked early and then other locations and commodities reacted and followed suit. Anxieties continued to rise around the world as Russian natural gas supplies were also threatened, thus spiking natural gas and electricity prices in many parts of the world. Algonquin basis price is shown in this graph in orange, and the full value price indicates that we are incorporating NYMEX costs from Henry Hub, as well as our regional basis costs here in New England. Finally, electricity prices on this slide are shown in blue, and they depict the ISO New England futures in dollars per megawatt hour. As Catherine previously mentioned, New England electricity prices are correlated with natural gas prices in the region, more so than other places in the US, which is why you can see a distinct correlation between the two commodities here. After a summer of high prices, prices started to lower as the winter brought warmer than expected temperatures. With a mild winter forecast and European storage inventories near an all-time high, prices subsided throughout the winter. Some of this story is impacted by robust production in the US, which we will see on the next slide.
Thanks, Charlotte. And yeah, hard to miss the correlation between these various commodities and price trends. So maybe some good news that the US is producing more gas than we ever have in history.
You're exactly right, Charlie. That's great news. The US has been able to revitalize their natural gas production to the highest historical levels after the COVID-19 pandemic. In this graph, you can see a visible production drop-off in 2020 as well as in February 2021 during the cold snap of Winter Storm Uri in Texas. There is also a considerable dip when the Freeport LNG facility in Texas had their explosion, leading to the absence of 2 BCF per day in the US's export portfolio. But this also had a considerable impact on the US's production, as you can see here. However, despite that large setback in the middle of 2022, US's natural gas production rose to a record 39 trillion cubic feet in 2022, marking a 33% growth since 2017.
Great news. So where is this gas going and how is that impacting price?
One key point to this story is that the US is shipping more gas out of the country than ever before. These exports are going to continue to support our domestic gas commodity prices. Over the course of 2022, the US competed with Qatar and Australia to be the world's largest exporting country of LNG. Much of this year counted out the Freeport LNG exporting terminal, which returned online earlier this year in 2023 and could very likely bump the US to the top spot. Global demand right now, specifically in Europe, is pushing prices up for our US gas exports and will continue to encourage more exports over time. US LNG exports will continue to be closely tied to these global prices, as the more we export, we continue to hold less supply.
Okay, and maybe you can help tie this back to New England and why this matters to us.
Right, so specifically in New England, we have nearly the same pipeline capacity as we did a decade ago. And this is creating a strong link between our regional costs of gas and electricity and what's going on in Europe right now. So the top half of this slide shows European natural gas imports by source over the course of 2022. LNG imports are on the top in blue, Russian imports are in the middle in mint, and all other European imports are at the bottom in green. The bottom graph depicts European natural gas storage over the course of 2022, with added lines from 2020, 2021, and 2023 to provide additional context. Over the course of 2022, Europe's natural gas imports from Russia decreased significantly due to those bans I mentioned earlier, but their storage levels somehow skyrocketed. And this was because Europe imported large quantities of LNG from the US in order to fill their storage to record high levels. In fact, 64% of US LNG exports in 2022 traveled to Europe. Currently, in 2023, Europe's storage is extremely strong, which could potentially lead to a glut in storage. But Keith and Larry will touch on this in much more detail in the next section.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. And just a few of my takeaways are that this natural gas market is very dynamic and complicated. We can't always rely on what's going on with NYMEX prices in the national news to understand our New England impact, because we're always going to have kind of unique costs of doing business here. And right now, more than ever, we have to pay attention to what's going on with LNG and throughout the rest of the world to know what our future might hold. So with that, I'll turn it over to Keith and Larry, who are going to lead us through our next section.
Thank you, Charlie, Charlotte, and Catherine for setting the table for Keith and I. We're going to continue the discussion on natural gas, as you've been hearing about from others. So I think we'll take a look at this first slide. And Keith, it looks like we're pretty stuffed with storage here, which pushed down the NYMEX recently. What does this mean in the near term and then further down the road for us in New England?
Yeah, Larry, building on what Charlie, Catherine, and Charlotte discussed, you can see on the slide the impact that supply, shown in the gray bars, that is the differential to the 5-year average, has on future prices, shown in dollars per MMBTU on the blue line. NYMEX prices increased from $3 per MMBTU in 2021 to $8 this past summer as inventory levels declined. Interesting fact is that supply actually began to fall just after the pandemic in 2020. Recently, prices have retreated back to $3 as inventories climb this winter due to increased production, lower demand resulting from unseasonably warm weather. This is a classic example of supply and demand economics, and it shows just how volatile prices are with the slightest change in supply and demand picture. Or, as we've been saying, the solution to high price is high price. Larry, what this means is that the undeniable world thirst for natural gas is destined to put prices under pressure in the future.
Great. So Charlotte mentioned this in the prior slides about exports. And why are these additional exports so key for New England to understand?
Great question. As shown on a prior slide on regional electricity generation fuel type, New England is the most reliant on natural gas. With US domestic LNG and pipeline exports increasing in the world, New England will be in competition with these global markets. What this slide is telling us is important. The gray section is the existing LNG exports. The blue shades show additional capacity coming online in 2025 and 2026. What this means is 25% more LNG capacity is coming online by 2026. This is a 6 billion cubic foot per day increase, bringing total exports to 20 billion cubic feet per day. And in summary, only 75% of our domestic production will be available for domestic consumption. And New England is and will continue to be a passenger on this bumpy and volatile ride.
Okay. As mentioned in the previous slides, we're at an all-time high for production. You're looking at ducts here. And Keith, why is it important to understand what ducts are and what happened the last time we saw a drop-off in ducts?
Larry, a duct is a drilled but uncompleted well. In this slide, the blue line is the number of duct wells and the orange line is the number of production rigs in operation since 2020. Production rigs have been climbing since late 2020. This is causing a supply increase. Drilled wells or ducts have decreased since the start of the pandemic. And what people need to know and understand is that oil and gas exploration and production is a highly complex and forward-looking business. That industry must invest billions of dollars today to produce a commodity that will be sold in the future. It was this situation that caused so many producers to pull back after prices plummeted after the pandemic. Companies tied to the E&P industry were not able to recover their investments in their forecasted timelines. A well is typically drilled years in advance of production. Our concern here is that with exports and demand increasing, but ducts decreasing, will the U.S. produce and transport enough gas to match future demand, the demand in the future? And as we're trying to say here, the smallest tweak in supply and demand can cause an extreme reaction in price.
So Keith, you talked a lot about the three drivers here: storage, production, and exports. And this is looking like the near terms are less expensive than the outer term years. Seems like the market's worried about this. What do we need to know?
Yeah, Larry, in my experience has shown that contango is just a dance that happens in historic low gas markets when the future prices are greater than near-term prices. We've seen this every time the market drops, and historically it signaled a market increase. This chart shows NYMEX future prices for calendar strips. Notice how the future prices for 2025 and 2026 are above 2024. Also note that recent settlements are well below the futures price. The example of April 2023 settling at $1.99 per MMBTU compared to the future prices of $4. These trends indicate that market research is driving traders to similar conclusions that we've highlighted throughout this presentation. The price spread we're seeing between 2024 futures and the 2026 future prices indicates the market sees risk factors increasing.
Okay, Keith, you've talked a lot about natural gas and how this has impacted New England and how will this impact New England electricity? And as we know, we're very dependent in New England on gas for our electricity generation.
Yeah, we wanted to make a couple of points here, Larry. This slide shows electricity spot pricing in New England over the past few years. Our first point is, as spot price in New England, when weather is reasonable and generation is not disrupted, spot price is predictable and mostly will be influenced by the NYMEX. If you look carefully at this graph, the price trends follow the NYMEX prompt month settlements we've shown in these prior slides. But number two, New England's generation mix of resources is fragile. This grid relies on multiple resources, and when demand for generation fuel increases in the winter, any disruption in supply chain of those resources results in extreme price excursions. Things that can go wrong that we've seen are delivery of LNG, delivery of oil to power plants, transmission of electrical imports and renewable resources, mechanical failures and outages are concerns for the market and this fragile infrastructure. ISO New England's been studying and documenting this concern for years. This slide provides two examples from the past winter. On Christmas Eve, when we lost imports from Canada, mostly Hydro-Quebec, and on February 9th, when temperatures dropped to negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit overnight.
So we know that the energy piece of this pie has gone up significantly based on all the things that we're describing today, but what else do we need to know about and be aware of in the cost deck as we go forward?
Like we're saying here, ISO New England has a plan to protect the grid and reduce risks. This slide shows electricity supply components trended over time. Renewable energy in green is the Renewable Portfolio Standards, RPS. Each state has a renewable energy goal aimed at reducing the carbon intensity of our grid. That plan has a cost to incentivize and reimburse renewable projects. Orange is capacity, or FCM. This cost has remained low due to out-of-market payments made to keep Mystic Station from retiring. The purpose of fuel security, that's the purple sliver that we start to see in 2022, is the cost of maintaining infrastructure and fuel inventories to protect the grid against supply disruptions in the winter. That has a cost that is passed on consumers in our supply pricing. Both fuel security and state renewable portfolio standards, RPS, are components that are passed through suppliers who in turn pass that on to consumers. And both of these components will continue to add cost to the electricity supply.
All right, so what do I do now? I have a contract expiring this year, maybe late next year. What should I be thinking about? What are my takeaways? What should I be focused on, Keith?
So Larry, the good news is NYMEX is back to decade lows. But in New England, gas basis remains elevated compared to historical averages, and therefore the full gas value of electricity and natural gas appear to have stabilized in a new range, increasing rates compared to historical averages. There's some difficult decisions that the folks that you just described are going to need to make over the coming few years. And what we recommend is what we've been recommending for years and we speak about all the time. Have a strategy, diversify and manage your risk, build a detailed budget, set strike prices, and monitor the market. The good news is that customers have dozens of options, more and more tools in the tool belt to manage this situation. And options like fixed price, spot price, blended and fixed spot are all ways to go about this. CES helps our customers build customized strategies to manage volatility using best practices, innovation, our knowledge, and our experience. This we found is the best way to approach a market that's obviously moving in different directions. And generally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, when we're in a contango situation where market futures are more than the prompt, it's an indication that moving ahead, looking towards the future is an important part of the strategy. This experience continues in our next section. From here, we're going to hand this presentation off to Matt and Evan for a real-world dive into the future. They're going to address the question, with the quest to decarbonization, moving electrification forward, what'll happen to this bridge fuel, natural gas, in the future?
Thanks, Keith and Larry, for leading us through that contango dance. I'm Matt Kamash, as Keith mentioned, and today's market focus has been centered on natural gas playing such a key role in our electric grid, as has been said ad nauseum today, determining future prices, driving the majority of our heating costs. However, in order to move beyond fossil fuels, as Andy previewed at the start of today's webinar, policy across the country and in New England in particular is increasingly pointing towards widespread electrification. So to look at this, Evan Perkins and I thought we'd start by sharing our own personal experiences with electrification. Evan, would you like to start?
Great, thanks, Matt. So over the last couple of years at our house here in South Portland, Maine, we have electrified a number of sort of appliances and parts of our personal energy systems. 3 years ago, my wife and I bought one electric vehicle, and this past fall, we converted our heating system for our home, which you can see on the left here, to a whole home heat pump solution. We had an aging gas boiler in the basement and a forced hot air system that was getting older and is coming due for some major costs and renewal. We're served by Unitil as our local gas utility, so we do have access to pipeline gas along the road. But it was time to make a decision around how we're going to heat the house moving forward. So we decided to re-up with a heat pump instead of a renewed gas boiler. Looking at the house, we have about 2,000 square foot single family home that was built in the early 1900s. The insulation is not great, to say the least. We actually found ripped up newspapers as the only insulation in the walls. So we decided to do a bit of insulation work in the basement and the attic, in addition to the heat pump work, which if we move to the next slide, we can see pictures of the outcome. So just to remind everybody, when we think about a heat pump, when we talk about electrifying heating at home, if you're using a heat pump solution, you're using a technology that transfers heat. It doesn't combust a fuel to produce heat and deliver it into the home. You can see the outside unit we have in the left-hand photo here. Depending on the season, whether you're running in heating and cooling mode, you have an evaporator unit that acquires heat, and then a condenser unit that releases that heat. So during the winter months, the unit on the left is capturing heat from the air, even at really cold temperatures, and then it transfers and releases that heat inside of our home. You can see the wall-mounted unit in the middle photo and the floor-mounted unit in one of the bedrooms upstairs. So that's the basics of how a heat pump works and how it worked for our house this past winter. Again, you're moving heat from one medium to another, and you can do that at really high efficiency levels. Matt, could you tell us a little bit about what you guys have been working on in your home?
Yeah, so here's a photo of my current single family home in Yarmouth, Maine, just 20-30 minutes up the road from Evan. After settling in, we learned our oil-fired burner was in pretty good shape, but after a winter of scheduling oil deliveries with concerns about driver shortages and running the carbon calculations in my head, I was eager to reduce our oil consumption through heat pumps. Perhaps equally compelling to that benefit was my wife's enthusiasm for the cooling benefits, especially in her home office during increasingly cool or increasingly hot and humid summer days. If you flip to the next slide, Charlie, you'll see our system. After reviewing our options, we also went with a Mitsubishi air source system, similar to Evan, except two separate units, a larger 15,000 BTU unit for the first floor and a smaller 9,000 BTU unit for the second floor. While we had to wait most of the summer before our turn in the long line of Mainers looking to install heat pumps right now, we had them set up just before the late August heat last summer. I should mention that while we had the sense our home was fairly well insulated, we did have an efficiency audit done to confirm and identify any room for improvement. And that work gave us the confidence that we could use this system efficiently. However, as I watched those electricity prices climb last fall, I was equal parts eager and terrified to see how the system performed during the upcoming winter. For the most part, heat pumps did great, kept the house very comfortable with the occasional help of our wood stove. How did your system perform, Evan?
Overall, really well. We had our install completed in early October, so right before the cold arrived. Just from a sort of comfort level and how livable the space was, the heat pumps were really an improvement over our old system. The old system we had, again, is gas-fired and forced hot air, so it sounds like a jet was taking off in our living room every time the boiler kicked on. Heat pumps were much more quiet. They have this sort of consistent push of air. So from a noise perspective, really none at all. That was great. And with the insulation work in tandem with the heat pumps, the space overall for the house was really kept to the temperature we wanted it throughout the winter. So from an overall sort of customer experience standpoint, we couldn't recommend heat pumps enough. They worked great at a bunch of different temperature ranges, which we saw this past winter. The one concern we had, if we move to the next slide, heading into the winter was, how would these heat pumps work when it got really, really cold out? And either for the better or the worse, we got the prime sort of test case for this in early February. That first weekend in February, this wasn't just in Maine, but around the Northeast in total, we had, I don't think it's too far to say, once in a generation cold temperatures. Cold temperatures in the -20 range. Added on top of that, when you had wind chill, it was approaching -50. So the photo on the right here is down the street from us. You literally saw smoke on the water. It was extremely cold, and we were really concerned, could those heat pumps work? What was your experience like, Matt, during that first weekend in February?
Yeah, it was brutally cold. And if you flip to the next slide, Charlie, like Bill Murray and Ghostbusters, we needed that backup. We had our baseboard heating kick on as the temps in our house dropped below the baseboard set points we had set. And it was really the only time this winter, besides the hot water, that our baseboard system was used really through the whole weekend to get us through those couple days, along with plenty of time by the wood stove. Actually, if you flip to the next slide, you'll see our backup system in our gorgeous basement here. We are definitely thankful for that backup and support. How about you, Evan? How did your system do during that cold temp?
None of our pipes froze, I'll put it that way. If we go to the next slide here, you can see our gorgeous basement and the old faithful gas boiler here. The gas boiler did work just fine. One of the things we did prior to the winter was test the boiler, got it tuned up. Basically, the heat pumps stopped working at around -20. They just couldn't transfer heat from the outside anymore. So our gas boiler kicked in, and for the next 36-ish hours, we were able to keep the house heated just fine. So we came out of the experience appreciating having a backup system and understanding sort of the limits of the heat pump technology, but it is a bit disconcerting where if you have pipes freeze, there's a lot of damage potential there, and that's obviously not a good thing.
Yeah, when you had that system kick on, Evan, I mean, it sounds like most of the winter you didn't need it. How much did your gas usage drop? I know our oil dropped by probably 75% or so. We'll see once we've completed a full 12 months.
You can see in the back of this photo here, we still have our hot water for the house on a gas boiler. So we're using a little bit of gas, but overall, the usage has dropped off a cliff. Looking at 2023, we're probably going to be about 90% below where we were prior to the heat pump installation in terms of gas use. So the amount of gas we're consuming from Unitil's local distribution network really has fallen off a cliff. And if we ultimately replace that domestic hot water boiler with an electric solution, it's going to fall even further, something over 90% annually. So if we move to the next slide, the key question here, if you think about this from Unitil's perspective and other gas distribution utilities, is how do you keep the system working if you have customers, basically dropping their annual gas consumption by 80, 90+%. And Matt, the answer is not a good one. It's very difficult financially for gas utilities to continue operating like they are while the revenues they get from sales drop. The cost to maintain the gas system, both to earn a reasonable return on capital the utilities have already spent, and then to basically cover ongoing operating costs, that's relatively fixed in the near term. So if you have a fixed cost you need to collect, but your gas sales are dropping precipitously as more and more customers shift over to heat pumps, basically you need to significantly raise your rates to make up that shortfall in revenue. So this notion that everybody can switch over to electrified solutions, but on these really cold days in the winter, even if they're limited, that the gas utility is going to be there long term and financially be able to make that proposition work where they're meeting those peak demands. There's a real tension there that's just simply not challenging. It's somewhat impossible to meet.
And not only do we have this financial concern, but if you move to the next slide, Charlie, we also have a pipeline system that will need ongoing investment and maintenance or risk potentially dangerous outcomes. Many of us in New England probably remember the Columbia Gas Merrimack Valley explosions back in 2018. Not long before that, some folks might remember the San Bruno pipeline explosion in PG&E territory out in California. In both cases, there were significant regulatory ramifications and new requirements imposed on utilities as a result. It'll be increasingly difficult to make those investments, make those commitments, impose those requirements as these systems are being used less and less. How are we beginning to see states navigate this massive problem?
Initially, if we move to the next slide, we're seeing this concept of a future of gas study. We have a couple examples we've seen over the last 1 to 2 years in California, Massachusetts, and New York. But essentially, the public utilities commissions in each state who are required to regulate the gas distribution utilities and ensure, one, safe, adequate, and reliable service, but two, just and reasonable gas delivery rates. And again, we're just talking about gas delivery here. The gas supply ramifications of this are separate and something we could circle back on in Q&A. But the question of, okay, we've got this big problem for gas utilities. We need to transition off gas, but we need to do that in sort of a measured, reasonable way. These studies have tried to look at, is there a pathway to try to basically manage this transition process effectively rather than just let's wait, see what happens and let chaos reign. So regulators at this point, I'd characterize it as they're studying the issue. They're getting more information from gas utilities and trying to put together a coherent plan. But at the end of the day, if you have fixed costs in the ground around an energy system that you use less and less annually, but still rely on as a backup system, there's just an inherent tension there that requires some sort of technological fixes or technology breakthroughs to advance. So this is certainly not trying to say to panic right now. It's good that regulators are starting to focus on this. But as we get deeper and deeper into the sort of electrification transition, this question, especially in the northern climates of the US, how do you balance these two needs? Moving off of fossil fuels, dropping that annual use, but figuring out what to do on those peak days. It's a real challenge that regulators and the public are going to need to be focused on more and more.
And we're obviously giving it a lot of thought, paying a lot of attention to these major questions. And if anyone has questions or wants to discuss, we're always happy to do that. And we're going to be keeping our clients posted as these proceedings advance. But for now, I'll pass it back to Charlie, who I think is going to lead us through our giveaway here.
Yeah, thanks, Matt and Evan. Great presentation, and yeah, brief interlude before we jump into the Q&A for the day. As we've done in years past, we have a few CES gifts that we've again will be giving away to the first 3 registrants for this year's seminar, and those 3 with the fastest fingers. Laura from Historic Deerfield, thank you. Don from Onyx Papers, I think a multi-year winner here. So you've got a couple records that you're now holding. Thanks, Don. And Tom Twist from Bates College. Thank you all, and we'll send your gifts in the mail. Appreciate you attending and being most eager and judging by the speed of your response and registration. So thank you. And what's left for today is a little bit of Q&A. Either I'm not seeing any in the channel here, or I'm just not dialed into the right location. But Andy,
we do have a few that have rolled in, Charlie, so we can address those. But now's your chance. So if our presentation left you wondering something, now's your chance to ask. So as you're thinking and typing, we can jump in. Matt and Eben, there was some interest in a cost comparison. I don't know if you could offer any thoughts about whether you saved money, came out behind or ahead, or were kind of neutral with your heat pump investments.
I'll take that first. So again, our sort of baseline was using pipeline gas. So looking at Unitil's delivery charges, the supply charges, versus what we paid to CMP and the default supplier for electricity. Under our calculations for the winter, we actually saved a bit of money. Both electricity supply and gas supply, obviously, as we've talked about in the past couple sessions here, both of those prices significantly increased heading into the winter, and basically covering that sort of November to April standpoint. One of the unique aspects we have here in CMP, Central Maine Power's territory, though, is there's actually an electric delivery rate targeted at heat pump users. CES helped design this in a rate design proceeding that happened at the Public Utilities Commission 1.5 to 2 years ago. And what that electric delivery rate does is actually drops a residential customer's rate from about 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour to about half a penny a kilowatt hour during the winter months. The reasoning being is that from a cost causation principle, the delivery network, the poles and wires, those are designed to meet summer peak conditions rather than winter load. So with that rate cut, basically, we were able to actually save a bit of money this past winter compared to using gas. That rate isn't available in other states or utilities. So this is something we hope more and more policymakers and regulators will pick up on, that there's an economic reason to reduce those electric delivery prices in the winter. Thankfully for us, that is in place, and we actually saved a bit of money.
Yeah, I think for us, it probably would have depended on the timing of our oil buys. There was definitely some periods last winter where oil was cheaper than gas, and therefore, we had timed the market perfectly, which no one can do. We may have come out ahead on oil, but both when you factor in the carbon ramifications, but also if we had not really paid much attention to oil and just bought it when we felt like we needed it, we would have come out probably pretty close to break even, and maybe a little bit ahead on the electric costs just through the winter. We'll see once we've gone through a full summer how that plays out as well. But yeah, I think the tariff that you mentioned, Evan, definitely played a big factor in that calculation.
Another question just came in with respect to hydrogen or biofuels as a potential option. We spent a lot of time setting up the shortage situation we have on peak days in the winter, and whether there may be a good alternative with hydrogen or biofuels. And to start, and somebody else jump in, but a couple of thoughts on hydrogen. We already need a lot of hydrogen currently in the US. We get most of that by reforming natural gas. So you may have seen a lot in the news about hydrogen and incentives. There's a lot of federal money sort of directed at standing up a new hydrogen manufacturing process where, instead of reforming natural gas, which has a lot of carbon emissions, we're getting that hydrogen from renewable sources, wind and solar. So we need a lot of that just to replace how we're currently producing hydrogen. At that point, we can look at, or maybe in addition to look at how we might use hydrogen as a peaking fuel. Part of the problem is that to manufacture hydrogen with electricity, you need pretty expensive electrolyzers. Hydrogen is a very, very small molecule. It's hard to store at volume, except with relatively expensive storage technologies. So it's kind of an expensive fuel as a backup, because you're not using that equipment with a very high capacity factor. It could make sense for in certain situations where you have a really high cost you're able to avoid or capture. But as a one-for-one replacement for natural gas currently, it's just really expensive. There are conversion losses when you go from using electricity to make the hydrogen, and that results in the electricity is expensive if you generate it purely from wind and solar, at least in certain parts of the country. So all that sort of stacks up to being a bit of a complex situation for a widespread adoption of hydrogen in the near term. We're clearly heading in that direction, looking to drive those costs down, maybe as we have over time with wind and solar, but it's just going to take a little bit of time. It's probably going to take some federal incentives, and initially we're probably going to see those hydrogen hubs sort of targeted at parts of the US where hydrogen can be made most cheaply and or the need is the greatest.
Maybe just touching on the biofuel aspect of that question, that I think biofuel, biomass, definitely part of the portfolio of a future-looking heating system here in the region that may help definitely, especially depending on the part of the region you're in, on your transition away from fossil fuels. Although there's some questions about biofuel availability, and there's sort of a bit of a chicken or egg problem that I know a few of our clients are working through or thinking about in terms of the amount of supply of biofuel in the region relative to the demands. We don't have a ton of regional supply available right now. A lot of it's being trucked in from other areas. There are plans in the works, but a lot of those plans are contingent upon the demand being there, and a lot of the demands is hesitant to make a commitment without knowing the supply is going to be there. So it's a tricky problem, but I think we certainly expect it to be part of the portfolio of heating solutions to move beyond fossil fuels in the region.
Thanks, Matt. We've had a number of questions about propane and how the information we've been sharing about LNG, natural gas. What does that mean for people who have large propane consumption needs?
Yeah, Andy, propane's in a similar spot as natural gas. There's very high inventory today, and we had a warm winter, so prices are low today, but the futures are trading much higher than the near-term prices. So the market's similarly in contango. Propane is also a secondary fuel abroad, so we do export significant amounts of propane as a byproduct of both natural gas fracking and oil refining. The production will continue to pace, but exports will offset. So if the oversupply now kind of sits, prices could come down a little bit, but the outer term prices are probably more in line, and they are higher than they are today.
Sorry. Eben, I'm going to direct this one at you. We've got a question about battery storage. We've sort of set up this situation where peak winter days, we just don't have enough natural gas supply to meet both thermal requirements and power generation requirements. We know there are a lot of renewable generation coming to the grid, but maybe not enough at the right times that we need it. How does battery storage fit in, and where do we stand in terms of pricing?
Battery storage is interesting here, in terms of thinking about, powering a heat pump or a heating system on a really cold day. That's one way to think about battery storage. The issue there is, one, you need an actual system that runs on a really cold day. So, if the heat pump can't run at -20, -30, you would need some sort of baseboard solution or something that can actually heat the building, assuming there's electric source. So you need the technology in your facility or your home to actually heat at that temperature. And then the question is, what provides the electricity to do that? Batteries are certainly one solution that could be used for that. The issue is somewhat the issue you raised with hydrogen, Andy. The seasonal storage nature of it is just extremely expensive. If you're trying to fill up a battery during the summer, fall, prior to winter, and then just letting it sit there to be used on a really cold day, it's a really expensive way to provide that peak heating need. So batteries technically could provide that service. It's just a challenge around financials to do it. Looking at the grid more broadly, we really don't need battery storage in the Northeast today to run the grid reliably. We have more and more renewable generation, but the grid itself can really soak that up without too much issue and without too much harm on the rest of the generation fleet. As we get 5-10 years down the road, batteries will become increasingly an important part of the power mix we have, and pricing does seem to be trending down consistently. So it's really a question of timing. Today we may add batteries, but we're doing that at a substantial cost. In the future, yes, on the grid more broadly for utility scale batteries, those will increasingly be seen around the region as an important part of the mix.
Thanks, Evan. We talked earlier about the need for LNG, in part driven by the lack of natural gas pipeline capacity we have into the Northeast here from some pretty prolific nearby shale production areas. Why don't we just build more pipelines into the region, and is that on the table? I'll hand that over to you, Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So back in 2016, Kinder Morgan, through the Tennessee Gas Pipeline Company, proposed the Northeast Direct Pipeline, which would have brought gas from that Marcellus region into New England. But also in 2016, that was chosen to not go forward by Kinder Morgan. They attributed the insufficient contracted capacity through regulatory procedures in New England that would not allow states to contract and go forward with pipeline builds for and paid for by the electric utilities. And so it is our impression and our opinion that here going forward, we aren't going to see additional natural gas pipeline infrastructure built in New England going forward.
Thanks, Keith. We had a early question regarding FERC and an upcoming stop they have here in Portland, Maine, to discuss LNG. And yeah, it's later. For anyone who's local, it's June 20th. And I think it just highlights a lot of the things we were discussing today, how, nationally it's gotten some attention, just how volatile and how high our prices in New England can get in the winter because of this dependence on LNG. And now because of the situation in other parts of the world where we need to outcompete in order to attract those natural gas cargoes. So this has obviously gotten FERC's attention. They're coming to town to try to spark continued conversations around solutions. But in the near term, the next 12, 24, 36 months, we're in this situation where we basically need to have high enough prices here on those peak winter months and days to make sure those cargoes are directed toward the US. These LNG cargoes are not quick to respond. They're scheduled to go to other ports. It can take days, if not weeks, to redirect them and get them to New England. So it's hard for them to turn on a dime in response to a dramatic short-term change in the weather forecast. So that forum may be interesting. There may be some further discussion there, but I think it just highlights really a situation that we're in. And thinking about on behalf of our clients over the next 36 months, how do we, bridge this near-term solution we have or problem we have with winter gas prices? We're really just about the end of the hour here, so I'll thank you all again for coming to our seminar. If there were any questions that were submitted that we didn't get to, we'll try to follow up on those afterwards here. But thank you all again for attending, and we hope it was worthwhile. Thanks, everyone.